By way of slight background, at the Central Bank of Ireland, I'm responsible for policy and risk. At the central bank, we regulate all of the sectors, let's say, and banks, insurers, asset managers, funds, and we regulate from both the prudential and the conduct and the consumer protection perspective. Also, of course, we have our financial stability mandate. So we do see the full picture, which is interesting. And what we're seeing at the moment is a very significant amount of activity. Since I would say the fall of last year, the level of in the first phase exploratory interest from firms located in the UK and now wondering how they will manage their EU27 facing business have been very actively engaged with us and many other supervisors across Europe. In the first instance, was working out, so what does it mean and how do we see the world, how do they see the world? And then as we go forward, getting more towards, well, I would say now a lot of firms are sort of in the concretization phase. They're in the phase of working out, finally, I would say many of them over the coming summer months will make their decisions as to what they will do to arrange themselves. And there's lots of firms with all sorts of different existing if you like, footfalls in Europe, and that's obviously very determinative in how they see their way forward. So lots of activity, I think, is the message there. I think so. My first slide here is just the context, and I think it's important to understand that because I think many of the discussions that are ongoing really do take their meaning from the context. And three things I wanted just to pull out to start off. The first is uncertainty. The uncertainty is just rife. No one knows where this is going to end up in terms of the large-scale political negotiations, or then more closer to home in terms of what will be the arrangement for financial services and financial markets across Europe going forward. So what we're seeing across the piece, both in firms and I guess amongst ourselves and the regulatory community, is encapsulated by hoping for the best and planning for the worst. I mean, there's no doubt that's the strategy that people are adopting, and we think from a regulatory perspective it's the right strategy because there's no doubt there's a non-trivial risk that come March 2019 things will not be in a great shape. So planning on that basis is useful. And the substantive presence discussion, the substance discussion, takes place in the context of an assumption that the UK will be a third country and that they will be outside the single market and not subject to the ultimate oversight of the European Court of Justice. That's the context in which the discussion is happening. If you take different assumptions, then of course you end up in different places, but that's the assumption on the sort of the planning for the worst basis that people are making. Secondly, time constraints. It's very important, at least in my view, and I think many colleagues, to note that Brexit was not chosen by the financial industry. It's not some kind of cunning strategy. So we're not dealing with sort of something the financial services firms wished to make happen. It's an enormous challenge for them, as it is for us and policymakers generally, and they're coping in particular with a lot of complexity, a lot of logistical challenges, and time frames that are almost impossibly tight to do some of the things that they need or want to be done. And at the same time, the cliff effect risk, the risk of things not being in a good place in March, April 2019. That's a risk, of course, to firms and their business, but it's also a risk that we in the regulatory and supervisory community have to take account of, both in terms of the sort of financial stability issues, and then more broadly, what does it mean in terms of simply the financial servicing of the different parts of the economy. So if you like, there's things in play here which are pressed by time constraints that we're all having to deal with, and we're all looking for solutions to. And that sort of drives, I think, a need for a degree of pragmatism, a degree of constructive engagement, not cleaving to sort of purist notions, but saying as long as we're not compromising on the core issues and the key matters, how can we pragmatically solve this problem? So there's a balance that needs to be struck there. And then I think the third thing to say is that people. You sometimes see the discussion. People sort of suggest, what's going on there? Why are they doing that? Why is that happening in that country? the fact is we're faced with issues that are very difficult, which have not really been discussed in any great detail before, and are complex to solve. So the question around the substantive presence, for example, it has never had this kind of presence in our discussions or in the things we have to solve for in the past. So it's inevitable that we're going to see divergences emerge before we converge again, and I'll say more about that in a moment. So turning to substantive presence and this question of putting it in very crude terms, and it's not terms I described to anyone, but you might characterize it as, okay, if we as a UK firm now want to have a subsidiary in the EU27 to continue doing our business, how much do we have to have there? Now, no one's asking that question in those terms, but that's sort of the question. What do you, the regulatory community, expect us to have in place for you to say, okay, we're willing to authorize you and to supervise you going forward? That's kind of the question. And there are at least 3 reasons why that is, possibly 4 reasons, why that is a very important question, and why we're all spending so much time thinking about it and trying to solve for it. The first is just this question of mismatch. If we end up with a reasonable large number of entities establishing themselves as subsidiaries, as legal entities in Europe, but their form does not match the reality. So if you have a mismatch between the form, so this is a legal entity doing such and such a business, but that's not the reality that underpins it, then we're storing up all sorts of difficulties for ourselves going forward. That's a sort of a morass that will take us ultimately into difficult places. So how we put this in the simplest of terms, and I think there's power in those terms, which is, if we are asked as a regulator to authorize and supervise an activity in Ireland, in this case, then we will want to know that business or activity is run from our jurisdiction. So it's as simple as that. If we're asked to authorize and take supervisory responsibility for the business, we want to know that it's run from our jurisdiction. And it all comes back to that at the end of the day. Why is that? Firstly, if it's not run from our jurisdiction, then it's being run from somewhere else. And if it's being run from somewhere else, then the regulatory standards, the supervisory requirements, the guidelines and the regulation that's applying are not the ones that we think are being applied, which are ours or the European ones, but they're ones coming from a different jurisdiction, and that's hugely problematic. So the business has to be where we are, it has to be run from where we are in order to avoid that mismatch. Secondly, and it's important to keep these two things often get confused, and it leads to confusion. A second issue, so one issue is this question of what standards and requirements are applying. The second issue, which is the third bullet, is a question of effective supervision. A firm has to be set up in such a way that you as an authority can supervise it. Now, we had over the past, let's say, 2.5, 3 years in Ireland, because of our large fund sector, we've had a long debate and dialogue with our industry and other stakeholders around this question of good governance and effective supervision of fund management companies. It's the so-called CP86 debate in Ireland, which has recently reached a conclusion. We published a feedback statement back at the turn of the year. But crucial to that was we developed our ideas around what is effective supervision. And as we went through that debate, where we ended up with saying that, of course, it's important that you have access to people and that you have access to documents and materials, and that in good times as well as bad times you can get your hands on the management. But beyond all of that, the firm and its management must be within your sphere of influence. You have to, the firm, the management, they have to feel that you as a supervisor are present in their lives. So that gives a certain certain requirements in terms of presence and location. It's not an absolute thing. It allows for global spread, European spread, but there must be some kind of centre of gravity which allows you to say as an influence, this firm falls within our sway, within our sphere of influence. They're not sort of so scattered and disparate that they don't feel at all who's supervising them. So that's part of that. And then finally, which is not a bullet point there, but I'll mention it, is resolution. The arrangements must be such that if things go wrong, we can effectively resolve it. And very importantly, that the risks will crystallize where you think they will crystallize. So again, it brings us back to this mismatch point. If there's a mismatch between the firm, the reality, and the formality, then in a bad time, the risks will crystallize differently than you expect them to crystallize. In terms of then the key aspects of substantive presence, and I'll run through this quite quickly because I'm sure Nicola is going to tell me to speed up momentarily. As I say, the starting question is the business being run from here? Right? That's the starting question. It's a holistic question. Okay, it's at least in my view, in our view, it's an error to get into a sort of a checkbox approach. And you do see, the question being asked. So how many people do I need to have? That's not at all the way we think about it. It is a holistic question. You need to look at the business, you need to look at the nature, the scope, the scale of the business, and you're trying to work out from a range of factors, well, yeah, is that business being run from here? Or is it not? And the second thing to say is that we are in an iterative process. No one at the moment, I think, has the answers. It's case by case, and then as that discussion is happening, also the discussion is happening at the conceptual level, both nationally and at the European level. So there's both those things going on. Clearly, governance is key. You will require the entity to have its board and a senior management team, and that board and senior management, both in terms of their makeup and their presence, must be consistent with the scale and nature of the business. Their interests and incentives must be aligned with the business. So the question of double hatting comes up and is one that needs to be very sort of. So if can you be the CFO of an entity here and also play a senior role in an entity in the UK? That's one of the issues that comes up and is a challenging one. The strategy, the decision making, risk appetite setting, risk management, internal controls. These all must be locally determined if the entity is really running the business from where it says it's running them. The resourcing of the entity must be consistent with the scale and nature of the business. The entity must have the responsibility in terms of acquiring, understanding, and managing its risks. You can't get away from the business of financial services is a risk-based business. The entity must be in charge of those risks. Otherwise, it's not in fact running its business. And you can see these concepts articulated quite well in the guidance that the SSM issued maybe 6 weeks ago now, and then that ESMA issued earlier this week. In terms of then specific aspects that are sort of very, very commonly occurring in the discussion, the first is to say, what is the view of group integration? Group integration, the fact that an entity is part of a group, can be an enormous strength and value, and it is entirely appropriate that an entity setting up in Ireland or anywhere else in the EU is leveraging that strength. Is taking advantage of the skill sets, the expertise, the resources, all of the things that make up a strong, well-run, high-quality group. So that's what the firm is trying to achieve, and that's what we want them to achieve. And then at the same time, you want to make sure that that's not leading to actually they're hollowing themselves out. They're basically ending up in such a place that all of the decision-making, all of the important issues are being put somewhere else. So we get this a lot in the discussion around back-to-back booking, and on the insurance side, quota share reinsurance, which in some ways are very similar. The idea that you You take the risk on somewhere in the EU27 and you immediately back it out to somewhere, in this case, in the UK. What is the view around that? And this is something that the SSM has talked a lot about.
What does quota share refer to?
Quota share is reinsurance, in effect.
Okay.
So it's on the insurance side.
I get it.
So you basically, you underwrite in your entity, but you immediately reinsure with another entity. And of course, those practices, back-to-back booking and reinsurance, are very common and very healthy when done well. So the question is, how is that made consistent with making sure that the entity is still in charge of and still running its business? I think key to it is making sure that there is a coherent, well-articulated risk management strategy. So we as a regulator will want to understand, so why are you doing it this way? And if the answer is because all our expertise is in the UK and we don't really want to move it anywhere else, then that's the wrong answer. If the answer is because we're setting up a well-balanced, well-integrated group whereby the risk is well understood and well managed in the EU27, but also we're leveraging our skills and our resource base elsewhere, then that's getting towards a much better answer. But all of these things are questions of balance. And as I say, the ECB SSM has talked about this. It has sort of said you must be able to manage the risks locally, and over time one will expect to see that at least some of those risks are managed locally. And now I will go to my last slide. Actually, just one thing before I do that is to briefly mention outsourcing, which is a hot topic at the moment. The question around outsourcing is about do you, as an entity, of course, outsourcing is a very, very common feature of the landscape and very beneficial and achieves lots of efficiencies and lots of enhancements. It can't be done to an extent that you're hollowing out the activities. It can't be done to an extent. You cannot outsource responsibilities, and you see this very clearly in the ESMA opinion that was published this week. You cannot outsource to the extent that either you're leaving nothing in terms of what's being done behind, or that you're outsourcing the responsibility. So you have to have in place the framework, the oversight, the abilities, the capabilities to make sure that you are still running that function and charge of that function, making sure that function is being done well. But of course, the tasks can be outsourced. Now, you'll see that the ESMA opinion gets into some discussions around third countries and outsourcing to third country. The way we read that is very much around, if you like, what I've just been discussing, that if you're outsourcing, for example, to the UK and the UK has left the EU and there's a hard Brexit, that can't be done in such a way that you're basically just putting the business back into the UK. The business must still be run from the EU27. But I think it would be incorrect to think that somehow this idea of outsourcing outside the EU has some that there's some legal constraint around that. There's not. If you look at the level 1 text, there's no constraint around where you outsource to. You may outsource to India, you may outsource to China, you may outsource to the US, you may outsource to any third country, as long as it's done effectively. And just to finish up then is just to say that one of the big discussions, and I started with this, so I'll finish with it, one of the big discussions has been around, is there divergence across Europe on these issues, and if so, is it giving rise to firms, when they're making their decisions, going the line of least resistance, going to where the interpretation seems to be the most easy to come to grips with? There was concern around that, and the fact that these are new issues and difficult issues could easily have given rise to challenges in that regard. We have been, in the central bank, we have been very keen that the European authorities step into that space and step strongly into that space. And I'm really pleased that both the ECB and the SSM, who clearly have decision-making power as far as banks, significant banks are concerned, and indeed LSIs as well, in terms of authorization, and also
LSIs is for less significant institutions in the ECB jargon.
Exactly. And then this week, and also in the other ESAs, we've seen ESMA produce its opinion. The other ESAs will also be producing opinions on these topics, and very importantly, ESMA has set up what is called a supervisory coordination network, which is basically a pretty hard-edged challenge framework, so that what's happening in different jurisdictions will be subject, in my view, to pretty significant scrutiny. So I think that's a really significant step forward. I'll stop there and we'll come back to questions.
Thank you so much. I forgot to say at the beginning, but I think you all know that this is a public session. It's actually live streamed. Everything is on record. So you can tweet, take pictures, whatever. Don't tweet like some star tweeters of the moment, but don't tell you to cough fefe in financial regulation. Anyway, Simon.
Thank you. The problem...
It's coming.
Here we go.
It won't be long.
Okay. This is the only slide I actually wanted. The problem with the discussion about substance requirements is that it is conducted in the language of the 1980s. If you think of anybody who has so much as caught a glimpse of the word fintech should at least be aware of the fact that the old idea here we go.
Sorry.
There we go. Should at least be aware that the old idea that financial services are conducted by a person doing a thing in a place is at least 20 years out of date. That's not how this industry works. I was talking to a head of trading at one of our larger banks the other day, asking him about moving business, and he pointed out that he could move 90% of his flow trading to Europe by shifting 6 people and a lorry load of service. This industry just is not localized. Risk management, another important issue. Risk management is not a bloke sitting behind a desk looking at a spreadsheet and scratching his head. It's a model. The model is centrally constructed. It accesses data from all over the place. The idea of saying, I want risk management in country X might have made sense in the 1980s. It really doesn't make sense today. So the problem is we're dealing with a fairly out-of-date regulatory architecture based on a set of territoriality concepts, which were a bit baffling. I mean, even with asset managers, if you think about it, the idea that a fund has a bloke who manages that fund and makes individual investment decisions, that is simply not how asset management companies work, or insurance companies for that matter, or have worked for a very long time. There are portfolio managers, there are funds. The interlinkages are really quite complicated. So the simple questions, what is it and where is there, are questions that don't have answers at the moment. And this makes just answering the question, what do you want in which place, extremely hard. And by the way, this is all changing very quickly. So decisions which are taken today about what do you want, what do you mean by substance and where do you want it, will almost certainly be badly out of date in 5 or 10 years' time. This is a very moving target. I mean, if the fintech revolution goes the way people think it's going to, even identifying who is a bank and what is a deposit taker is going to become impossibly difficult, much less access to payment services and all the rest of it. So what we're trying to do is to hit a fast-moving target with some rather out-of-date bows and arrows, which is why this is so hard to pin down. Now, one of the important things about substance requirements, this is a new issue for most continental European supervisors. The reason for that is for the last 25 years or so, if you're a third country firm and you wanted to access the European market, you did it by setting up a subsidiary in London and servicing out of there. What that does mean, however, is that London has had 30 years' experience of this problem. Now, if you look at the standard UK orthodoxy, these are the PRA's principles, but this hasn't changed for as long as I can remember. You must have not only your registered office, but also your head office in the United Kingdom. In other words, overall management has actually got to be here, exactly as Jerry was saying. You've got to ensure that your close links, in particular links with parent undertakings, subsidiaries, and other entities, are appropriate. So a requirement that local management must be freestanding, independent of group management and all the rest of it. And capital and finances have to be capable of being freestanding. What you can see there is, I think, pretty much exactly what Jerry was saying. And the real point here is if you sit down with a clean piece of paper and ask yourself, what are my requirements? Pretty much everybody gets to pretty much the same answers. So when you look at Sabine Lertenschläger's famous sentence a few months ago, we will not accept shell companies, anybody, it must be a real bank. You take that apart, and what you've got in there is exactly the requirements the PRA has had for as long as anybody can remember. Actually, there really is no difference of policy between any supervisors that I'm aware of as to what it means to be in a place and what the minimum necessary is to be authorized in that place. And by the way, I would say that certainly from my point of view, looking at it from a kind of banker's perspective, one of the thoughts that can't help occurring is that although there is a lot of policymaker worry about the idea of a regulatory race to the bottom in this area, there is absolutely no sign of it amongst the regulators that we deal with. That's probably a good thing. It would certainly be rather surprising if it happened. But actually, you know, what the desiderata, I think, are common across all supervisors. The question is, when you get into, for these four issues, what do you actually mean? Now, you think about banks, the simple example. By and large, you look at a bank risk management function, at least half of it are engaged in credit analytics. Now, that is not the traditional, you know, bloke looking at a company and using a pocket calculator to add up the spreadsheet. That's a very complex, institution-wide bit of risk measurement software. The question of how do you deal with that? Answer: the people in the front office who make decisions access that thing by tapping into a terminal. Do you really care where the people are who build that model? Answer: probably not. You do care about the head of risk. You care about the man who's in charge of designing the model.
Or the woman.
Or the woman.
We're getting pretty strict on these.
The chap or chapess who is in charge of designing the model. But if you are looking at, you know, a global bank, the odds are that those people are going to be dotted around in half a dozen places around the world. They will work cooperatively because these things are not actually all done by a single chap sitting on or chapess sitting on a throne. So the question of what do you really want? What are you asking for here? Becomes a very hard question to answer if you are happy for your domestic subsidiary to be plugged into a global risk management system. Now, one possibility is you might not be. One possibility is you might be saying, I actually want to completely ring-fence the thing in my jurisdiction so that it is effectively unconnected with the rest of the organization of which it is a part. But why would you do that? You know, this is equivalent to closing your jurisdiction to foreigners, and there is a certain sort of surely there is some midway between this. Well, there probably is. We just don't know how to do it yet. There's a very important corollary to this, by the way. This is specific to banks and investment firms, but it is worth mentioning. Fundamental review of the trading book, as coming soon to a bank near you through CRR2. FRTB is based on the idea that trading is done desk by desk. One of the many things we don't know about FRTB is whether it is going to be possible to have cross-border desks. In other words, can you have a single government bond trading desk with a single government bond trading model that has people in New York, people in London, people in Frankfurt, people in Singapore? Or is it in practice going to be the case that all of those have to be separate independent trading desks operating off separate independent trading models? Nobody knows the answer to that one. But if we can have global trading desks, does that mean that the local supervisor has to admit that he's no longer got any control of that risk? If we can't, then how does the supervisor supervise the local modelling support? Again, interesting stuff, no obvious answers. We asked the question about staff. Which staff? Now, this is one of the areas where the UK position and the European position really are not even remotely symmetrical. The way that the PRA looked at third country banks coming into London was to say, I will require you to go out and hire experienced senior local staff and experienced senior local directors. The PRA's view was, and the Bank of England's view before it, was sometimes rather unkindly characterised as wanting somebody who was one of us on the board of them. But actually, that's not a completely inaccurate way of looking at it. Neither is it the worst way to approach this particular challenge. But if that's, if you can't do that, if there just aren't, you can't say you just go and recruit enough people locally, because there aren't enough people locally. Actually, importing more and more of them isn't always going to give the supervisor the same degree of confidence that what he's actually getting is real local control and real local management. And in particular, I mean, the other very important point that Jerry raised, if you relocate the head of trading from London to Frankfurt, he'll probably remain head of trading. The bulk of his job is probably still in London. If you're the German supervisor, how comfortable are you about that, really? You know, this stuff is hard. Most banks, most investment firms, most people will tell you that they've probably slightly overinvested in London in the last 10 years anyway. Canary Wharf may be the most expensive spot on the face of the planet to keep staff. And particularly as far as client coverage is concerned, there has been a move to push people out away from the centre and closer to the clients for some time. There's also been a significant amount of outsourcing just driven by costs. You know, you'd be amazed how many London-based banks have enormous processing operations in places like Poland. So actually moving people out of London is something which has been happening, but the whole question of which people, how, who, and the local managers, how do they interact with the group's senior management, this is all really hard stuff. And the problem you have is that with the best will in the world, writing this stuff down is impossible. You know, if what you're trying to do is to say, this is how I want the head of risk to interact with the local head of risk, you know, you can write pages and pages of guff, or you can pay lawyers to do it. Everybody knows, they know, the supervisor knows, their own manager knows. That's really not going to have any significant impact on their actual day-to-day behaviour. So you can say, oh, well, these are the reporting lines. Here is a beautiful org chart. Answering the questions, how will this actually work, is generally something you won't know until you try it. And that takes us to operational management. What do you have to manage to be a manager? There will be all sorts of management in local establishments. You know, somebody's got to employ the secretary, somebody's got to lease the photocopiers. It's not that there won't be management, it's that that sort of management isn't the sort of management that the supervisor is even remotely interested in. I'm sure you'll be familiar, many of the older banks who used to have national operations, it tended to be a bit of a running joke that in some of these offices, the national operation was a fortress, and nobody in head office could find out anything about what was going on in that particular country, just because you happen to have a particularly strong-willed head of country who managed to convince everybody locally that they were all reporting to him. Other countries, same organisation, identical procedures, head office could actually find out what was going on locally, and in some cases head office could micromanage what was going on locally. If you were to ask what are the drivers of that, you know, is it to do with the bank's culture? Nope, it's just to do with the people. And again, all good supervisors know that the first thing to watch out for when keeping an eye on any potential crisis is sort of the overmighty ruler who refuses to allow anybody in his empire to speak to anyone else. But
that's generally a he.
That's almost invariably a he, come to think of it. Yes.
There might be exceptions.
But of course, the difficulty for the national supervisor, and this is where we get into another bit of interesting UK learning. The people who are best positioned to keep an eye on your country head are actually the global heads in that organisation. So no matter how keen you might be on establishing local autonomy, in a funny sort of way, your closest allies in terms of the supervision of what you are there to regulate are the colleagues in the very organisation whom you're trying to create separation from. All of this is really nothing more than a long way of saying, we're learning this, we don't know how the process works. I would say one last thing about local booking, and in particular this wonderful discussion about back-to-backing. Back-to-backing into a subsidiary is not nearly as easy as it sounds. If you just take all the risk off as soon as it happens, all that happens is that the subsidiary ends up with an enormous large exposure to the parent, which the parent then has to collateralize, which means you end up with a dead pool of cash in the subsidiary, which costs a fortune. So actually, in terms of managing the risk in subsidiaries, that is harder than you'd think. It also increases cost because you have to leave some risk behind. It increases capital requirements on a group-wide basis because these things don't completely cancel out. There are all sorts of ways of moving risk around a group. None of them are free. So if you have a subsidiary which is really independent and really acknowledged by its regulator to be independent, you have to remember that the environment within which that operates will mean that doing business out of that subsidiary will almost necessarily always be a little bit more expensive than doing the identical piece of business directly off the home balance sheet. And if you think through the drivers that creates for conduct, for behaviour, for the interaction between the subsidiary and the parent, then that, I think, helps you to contextualise the problems, and in particular, to contextualise the, how do we put this politely, the incentives to do things not quite in accordance with what you said to the regulator you were going to do that are inherent within this structure. I think we'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Simon. This was splendid to set the scene. I guess it's impossible not to think of some paraphrase of Mrs. May and say that if a financial firm brands itself as a citizen of the world, it's probably a citizen of nowhere. Because we're slightly behind time, my mistake, I'm not going to ask questions myself, but I'll give Jerry an opportunity if you want to react to what Simon said briefly, or should we just go
Let's throw it open. Let's throw it open. Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
So we open it up. The rules are easy. Please raise your hand or catch my attention somehow. Introduce yourself briefly, ask a question or pretend to ask a question, and please.
Thank you. So I am Stéphane Pontoiseau, Head of Market Intermediaries at the AMF, the French securities regulators. And of course,
that's the AMF, not the IMF.
Yeah, AMF. Not global yet. So a lot have been said, but I would like to stress some of our views. First of all, clearly outsourcing is nothing new. We are all used to authorize and supervise firms that rely on outsourcing, more or less, inside or outside the group, inside or outside the EU. And there are well-known principles that were described just before a moment in the European regulation. Also, we believe at the IMF that there would be a benefit to align UCITS requirements and AIFMD requirements. However, we have to recognize that Brexit creates a specific context. Potentially, we will see firms massively outsourcing to a future third country. There's time pressure on the firms to adapt, so that's an incentive to minimize, of course, relocation of staff, technical means, and capital. That's perfectly understandable. And there is a competition between financial centers to attract business and jobs. So that could induce a race to the bottom. So we at EMF are, of course, strong supporters of ESMA initiatives, as well as SSM, as my colleague from Ireland just said. We believe there is value to promote supervisory convergence and make sure we all look at the question in the same way. That being said, we have to recognize that it's a very tricky issue. The general principles all sound common sense. If you read the ESMA opinion just released, it all sounds common sense to most of us. But it's true that it's extremely challenging to then go into the details and try to issue specific guidance. ESMA is currently working on sector-by-sector guidance. It's important that we somehow go into the details to see how we translate these general principles in the real world, I would say. But I fully agree that we have to remain pragmatic, and this cannot be a checkbox approach. My experience of authorization tells me that it's always a case-by-case approach. We have to appreciate the level of risk, each measure to manage this risk adequately. And we also have to recognize that outsourcing is also, as soon as it's well managed, a powerful factor of operational performance, of quality of service. So clearly we should not see outsourcing as an evil. Just has to be properly managed, and we will need to be pragmatic each time we will review authorizations, and there is probably value to have exchange of views between regulators as it's planned within ESMA.
Thank you very much, and thanks for coming, by the way, because it was also one of the aims of the session to have an exchange also among different authorities to the extent relevant. Please.
Thank you. Sheila Nichol from Schroders. Thank you very much both for actually some very stimulating thoughts, and in many ways sparked by the challenges of regulating entities that are operating in multiple jurisdictions. I haven't heard any reference to regulatory cooperation in these discussions. And indeed, there seems to be almost a move away from that, because if you read the ESMA paper, there is a lot of insistence on, or there are two references to a right to have access to the site of anyone to whom activity is outsourced or delegated, and indeed the right to do on-site visits without the approval of any other third party. And that sounds very much like a nationalistic approach of saying we are going to do this and we are going to do this ourselves. And that, I just wondered, I suppose for both of you, but particularly for Jerry, where does regulatory cooperation come into this?
Jerry, do you want to comment on that?
So let me pick up. I think on both those sets of comments, which I think are very pertinent and to the issues that are being wrestled with. On the so I agree with an awful lot of what was said by the colleague from the IMF, and I think there's an awful lot of common ground there. I suppose the one thing that for me is important, and it has been and continues to be, is that there are two things at least two things that are happening here. One is at the political level, we will see over the coming period of months very high intensity, very difficult, very significant negotiations going on, and they will go to the heart of many of the things that many of the assumptions and the tenets upon which we currently base ourselves. It is important that we as regulators don't get ahead of that. There are some big issues that are for discussion there. We as regulators have a set of issues we're trying to deal with now, and it is particularly this issue of convergence and avoiding divergence and making sure that we all act in some degree of coordination. That is our challenge, but that is within the current dispensation. We know the legislation, we know the framework. It has been both technically and politically built up over a significant period of time, and it should not be for regulators. And I don't think it is, but I think it's worth saying. It should not be for regulators to go beyond that. So we must operate within the confines of that, and I think that is very important. On the question, so Sheila, you're right in a way, but also on this question of regulatory cooperation. At the beginning of my remarks, I said, and I think it is, that the discussion is happening on the basis of a hard Brexit. So there's sort of an assumption that we're facing a period of that we may be, that there's a non-trivial risk that we may be facing a period of time where there is just a sharp break between the EU27 and the UK in terms of the level of legal and structural integration. That's sort of it's the plan, hoping for the best, planning for the worst aspect of that. But I totally agree with you that wherever we end up, the issue of regulatory cooperation will be absolutely central. And I think as a regulatory community, that is a very significant part of our DNA.
So just to decode, your question, Sheila, was primarily in terms of regulation between the UK authorities and their counterparts in the EU27. Do I understand correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
I think
it's probably obvious to everybody, but let me just emphasize this. Okay.
Yeah, and so to my mind, if we end up somewhere where we have, whatever it might be, the sort of whatever equivalence becomes, or some kind of partnership, or whatever those arrangements are, hopefully, from a regulatory point of view, the degree of integration remains pretty strong, and therefore the regulatory cooperation remains pretty strong. Even if we don't, regulatory cooperation must remain and should remain pretty strong. But I guess what we're all looking at is the fact of, if we end up in a political world where there is a break, and where therefore we can no longer assume that the same rules will apply, how do we deal with that? So that's why you're not seeing the sort of the regulatory cooperation bit come through. But I don't demur from anything you've said. I think exactly absolutely right.
Couple of words on that. We do have to distinguish between regulation and supervision. As far as regulation is concerned, there is scope for cooperation. As far as supervision is concerned, there is no infrastructure, there will be no infrastructure in place after a hard Brexit that really permits any sort of supervisory cooperation. You have to remember, supervisors are bound by the legislation that creates them. Supervisors are not allowed to cooperate outside the scope of their legal remit. And in the investment firm world, where supervision is not coordinated at the European level and is national, then creating the framework for that sort of supervision is going to be exponentially harder. I strongly believe that there will be a hard Brexit with no agreement. And in that situation, I think there is a very real risk that the supervision of major European firms will simply fall apart. Something else you have to remember in this context, European banks, all the big European banks, have broadly got their trading businesses in London. They're going to have to be branches. They're going to be regulated by the UK authorities. If there is no cooperation between the main supervisor and the UK supervisor in respect of them, that is a threat. It's a threat to the UK, it's a threat to Europe. This is a very, very serious problem, and there is no sign at the moment of anybody addressing it.
So I have a number of questions. I will ask everybody asking questions to be reasonably succinct, and I will also ask our speakers to be succinct in their answers, because we want to take as many questions as possible. I think we'll start here.
Merci, Nicolas. Florence Outrella, GFI. Two very short questions. It seems to me that the regulator and the lawyer completely disagree, that you made two very different presentations. One saying that you should grasp the substance and the reality of activities in your country, and the lawyer saying you can't grasp that. So I would be happy.
It might be a regulator and a lawyer. It might also be an Irish regulator and a British lawyer.
In addition, that makes it still more difficult. But I would have liked to have the answer of the regulator to this very idea that there's no it and there's no there. And the second very short question that you partly answered already, Simon, what would be a good deal? If there is no harm, if there's something, what should it be for the best?
Yeah, let's spend a succinct time on this.
So go straight in. Okay. So very briefly. So I pick the question you asked when Simon started speaking. I wondered. So are we saying very different things? And as I listened to Simon, I actually thought, no, I think we're saying quite similar things, which is yes, technology and the advancement of risk management and risk modeling and group integration has taken us a massively different place than where we were 20 years ago. So if we were 20 years ago, this would be an easy thing to deal with. The fact is that because we are where we are now, it is a very difficult thing to deal with. And that is, I think, why we're wrestling with it. So it's not that it no longer matters. It's just that you have to really work with, well, what does it mean to be running your business from Paris or to be running your business from Dublin if actually the risk model is a global risk model. So it's very difficult, but I think there are answers, and I think it's finding the answers that we are currently engaged in. Maybe I'll let Simon answer the good deal part of the question.
Yeah, well, oddly enough, that's the easier question to answer. A good deal for both sides would be the broad continuation of where we are now. Brutally, for the next 10 years, the City of London is going to remain Europe's primary financial centre. After that, don't know. Next 10 years, fairly clear. Europe must have a strong say in the supervision of that financial centre. That would strike you as a sort of non-negotiable minimum. There's a very obvious trade-off for that. If Europe has a
by Europe, you presumably mean the EU27.
EU27. There's a fairly obvious deal there to be done. If the EU27 can have a satisfactorily substantial say in the regulation of the city, then there is no reason why some sort of equivalence-based market access approach should not continue to operate. So that's that's the win-win. I must say, I don't believe there's the slightest chance of getting there.
So obviously the question that remains open, Florence, is what would we have heard if we at Bruegel had invited an Irish lawyer and a British regulator? Question here, I think.
Thank you very much. Jutaro Kaneko, Japan Center for International Finance. In order to measure the Brexit's impact on city, I find it also important to realize potential impact on financial market infrastructures. In this regard, I'm very curious to know the future treatment of CLS Bank and access banks, UK banks' access to Target 2. Apart from the future treatment of LCH ClearNet. So what do you think we should have in mind in this regard? Thank you very much.
I can answer the second one of those fairly easily. We currently allow Swiss banks to access Target 2, so there's no theoretical obstacle to UK banks accessing Target 2 post-Brexit. That is an operational decision for the ECB. The same, to some extent, I think, goes for CLS. There is nothing in Brexit that should necessarily and automatically result in a cessation of access. That does not mean that access will necessarily and automatically continue, but there are precedents for solving all of the issues that Brexit creates.
No, I don't think I've got much to add to that. Really, I think it's the dynamic that the negotiations may or may not unleash that I think is the thing from a sort of a regulatory and a financial stability perspective to worry about. So I guess we can all. I won't speculate too far, but I think we can all identify, sort of from a financial services perspective, what would be the best answers. You know, you can differ, but you can sort of get there. I think the challenge is how they get delivered in a political context as we are seeing, and that's frankly just beyond my remit.
Donald?
Donald Ricketts from Fleischman Hill. I just wanted to come back on what was mentioned on supervisory cooperation, because I think there are distinct points here. There's a difference between recognition, access across borders, and existing activity between firms, within groups, across borders, and the question of supervision of those activities. And you could see that the question of access to a market falls very much within the remit of a broader conversation in a negotiation. My question is really, do we think that the orderly functioning of markets falls within the Brexit negotiations or outside the negotiations? And the question of, and it's a very different, I realise it's a difficult one to answer, but because clearly cliffs have implications politically, and therefore to an extent they do, but on the other hand, supervisors have responsibility to maintain orderly functioning markets. So do we think that preparing for the worst applies to supervisors as much as to firms, and that preparing for the worst includes getting in place MOUs which enable data sharing and continued orderly functioning of markets, or do we think that that falls within the remit of negotiation?
So let me have a first stab at that. So I think you make a very good distinction, Donald. I think it's absolutely right. And my basic answer is yes, you're right. The prepare for the worst applies to supervisors equally as it applies to others. And I think at the end of the day, we all have financial stability as well as consumer protection and effective financial regulation remits. So I think that is something that, to my mind, we will need to be focused on over the next short and thereafter period.
Gary, not asking for any insider information here, especially as we're in a public session, but isn't that already happening?
Yeah, it is happening, but I think in fact the focus at the moment, frankly, has been the intense focus has been on where the strong activity is, which is the question of the location of activities. And in that context, a lot of discussions have been happening, because you're absolutely right. The entities that move from, for example, to take that example, entities that move from the UK to EU27, or activities that move from EU27, will still be part of a group, and the regulation and the supervision of that group remains something which is of interest to both sides, if I can use those terms. So that kind of interaction is clearly ongoing. I think the larger, so I think there is lots of engagement that is going, but I'm agreeing with Donald that as we move forward into this, I think we're going to have to ramp up different forms of cooperation. I think that's right. And it goes back to Sheila's point. I would agree with that.
I would just caution against assuming that supervisory cooperation is something supervisors can agree amongst themselves. And supervisors can really only do these things properly if they have sort of sufficient statutory cover, and that will push the discussion up into the political arena, whether you like it or not.
But is that true? Because in terms of crisis management, if perhaps not in crisis prevention, I guess it really depends which sort of crisis we're talking about. But one lesson of the big episode of crisis of 2007, 2008 is that central banks, for example, so if we think of critical infrastructure and that sort of supervisory duties that have something to do with financial stability, have been able to talk to each other pretty effectively at many points of the crisis. I'm not talking about the resolution of or the management of, say, Fortis, but if you think of the really super systemic critical stuff.
But as a counterexample, look at the debate over euro clearing. The reason the French are so worked up about this is at the height of the euro crisis, LCH, for whatever reasons, believed to be on the instruction of its supervisor, jacked up collateral requirements on a bunch of banks in a way that was viewed from this side of the Atlantic as, imperiling the euro and the future.
You probably mean the channel.
It's the Atlantic for Spain, isn't it? But these were decisions that were perceived here as imperiling the euro and the European economic system. But as far as the UK regulators were concerned, they had a very clear statutory mandate, which was the economic stability of the UK. So it doesn't take much in a crisis to put supervisors in a position where no matter how much they might want to cooperate, they are effectively prevented from doing so by their national legislative mandates. And supervision only really matters in a crisis.
By the way, you're right to mention that point on CCPs, because it's often ignored that this is precisely the driver of the current debate. And of course, there is a sort of mercantilist overlay, and it does exist also. I speak as a proud Frenchman. But I think what you mentioned is really what makes this debate so animated. You also reminded me of Chancellor Philip Hammond's remarks that the UK thinks of itself as a mid-Atlantic country.
Always does. We'll do clearing, you can do yogurt.
I'm not going to react to that. But I do have a follow-up question, which is inside, and which I guess is for you, Jerry, inside the EU27. You mentioned, and I guess that also counts as supervisory coordination or cooperation, the process that ESMA is initiating of the sort of, robust cross-checking. I don't remember the exact jargon. Can you give us a bit more language, and maybe that's explained in the ESMA opinion, on how this is enforceable or going to be enforced?
Yeah, so the strict answer is that it is not legally enforceable. It's not even, in fact, strictly speaking, guidance. It's an opinion, because it was decided that in terms of the timelines are very tight. So the quickest thing to do is an opinion. So we will do an opinion, and that's what we did. So legally, it's not enforceable. What the debate then that also went on, I think I can say, there was a discussion around. So how do you give it as much bite as possible that is consistent with legal responsibilities and accountability? So there was a debate around, can we bring individual applications and authorizations to the table at ESMA, and sort of should an authority be explaining what it's doing in respect of individual material applications? And there was a feeling that probably goes beyond the sort of the legal dispensation, sort of the accountabilities, the responsibilities, which is what the current framework is. And so what we will have is a network of senior level supervisors from the competent authorities, who will be required, who are required under peer accountability, if you like, to moral suasion, to bring to the table the key issues that they are seeing, and the key questions that they are answering, and how they are answering them in relation to anonymous cases.
So they won't give the name of the firm?
They won't give the name of the firms.
So that's, if I remember correctly, that's pretty similar to what they do on financial reporting, right?
Yeah, that was
IFRS enforcement.
There's debate around how similar, how different it is, but I think the narrative would be that it's quite similar to
and
that.
I think the general view, at least in the industry, is that on financial reporting, it has not led to convergence.
Yeah, so it's new territory in terms of authorizations. My own view is that what ESMA is doing will be effective. I think because I think the first of all, the debate itself has been an intensive debate, an intensive discussion around these issues, and a lot of it has been a learning thing. Kind of, well, actually is, to Simon's kind of point, these are difficult issues. How do we think about them? So there's already been a lot of coming together, and I think, yeah, sure, at the end of the day, you may have disagreement, and you may have an authority who says, look, I don't agree with that. But I think it's much more difficult to say, I will do something that is, really beyond what people would think is sort of an appropriate way. I think it brings within a very, not absolute convergence, but within a significant degree of convergence how we approach it. So yeah, that's the legal word.
I have another question, which is to Simon, and we mentioned both ESMA and the SSM, but obviously the legal framework is different. And there's a lot of debate in many firms. I'm not talking here about insurers or asset managers, but say investment banks, whatever that means, on the choice of legal form, right? I mean, will there be a bank or will there be a broker-dealer in the, or investment intermediary in the EU27? And obviously that has an impact, at least at the current juncture, on how they will be supervised and by whom. Can you give us a bit of color or what is at stake in this sort of choice, and how you see the debate evolving in the last few weeks, in the next few weeks, stance of the ECB, stance of the Fed, that sort of thing?
Well, remarkably little is the answer. I mean, there's a strong view amongst the larger firms that actively being a bank is a good thing because that will get you SSM supervision. I mean, the single most important thing if you're a London-based broad service bank moving stuff into Europe is the sophistication of your supervisor. And being an investment firm in a country with a small investment supervisor is fairly frightening in that regard, particularly if you're going to want to operate a trading book model.
But the Central Bank of Ireland is a big investment supervisor.
Yes, exactly.
Well done, Nicola.
But I mean, you think about the number of European countries with big investment supervisors, and you really fingers of one hand.
A healthy hand?
Yeah, possibly. But it matters to I think the thing that matters most to firms is that the supervisor is going to be able to understand their business, approve their models, and grasp their risk management processes. That actually doesn't give you a very large pool of possible options.
But are you implying that the big firms that may face this choice between broker-dealer or bank are leaning towards bank at this point?
Yes, because that gets you SSM supervision.
Okay. No outliers?
Not that I can think of is
Okay.
the answer. I mean, the risk of being caught with a supervisor who who sort of isn't fully up to speed with your business is quite significant, and it's something that firms don't particularly want to take.
Interesting. So let me give it back to the floor. Sorry, I retained it for some time. If you don't have questions, I have more, but I prefer if you have questions.
Ed has a question.
Yeah, please.
Sorry, I didn't see.
Where was it?
Ed.
Yeah.
Hi. By the way, congratulations on your live stream. Eurostar was delayed an hour, but I followed everything perfectly. Edward Bowles, Standard Chartered, one of the firms that has taken a decision to apply.
Congratulations to them. They're doing all the
well done,
real
gents.
stuff.
Jerry, could you reflect a little on Sam Wood's letter to all firms operating in the UK and what the reaction has been over here? We heard earlier this week that perhaps the SSM is now asking the EU27 firms with operations in London to vet their responses with them before they send them in. On the 9 principles ESMA put out, the first one was no automaticity of authorization recognition. Does that extend to model approval? Is the EU really ready to go through massive model approval exercises for market risk books, etc.? How does that then get into supervisory cooperation? Because these supervisors are all part of the college of managers for these firms anyway, the college of supervisors. They are going to be meeting
Not
regularly.
of managers.
College, indeed. So just some observations on that would be good.
And that was Ed Bowles from Standard Chartered.
So I read, the SSM has been very, I think, at least to my mind, very, very clear on the issue of internal models, which is a question of not grandfathering per se, but that given the it goes back to what I was saying earlier on in terms of trying to balance rigor with practicable feasibility, and so the idea that if you have a model which is currently approved by the PRA or FCA, who are approving that as high quality supervisors acting within the framework of the EU, there's a lot of significance to that fact. So it allows you some freedom of movement and flexibility. So the SSM has articulated the fact that for a period of time, the models can continue to be used by the newly authorized entity, even though they have not yet been per se approved, fully approved by the SSM. Though, of course, that's subject to a number of appropriate conditions in terms of the suitability of the model and engagement with the UK supervisor. The bit you refer to in the ESMA opinion, if you read down to the next principle, then so how I read that and my interpretation of it is that in terms of authorization, the formal authorization and the requirement to be authorized, there is no fast-track approach. So I think it puts to bed that argument that somehow because you are currently authorized as an entity in the UK, you can then say, well, just fast-track us here because it's a new entity. It's not the same entity, it's a new entity. It's got new management, it's doing new business, so it's a new entity. So the authorization requires to be fully done in the EU27. In my mind, that does not apply to the question of, for example, things like model approval. That's not part of the authorization per se. That's a separate issue around risk management and capital calculations. And if you look further into the document, there's discussion around reliance on, for particular aspects, what's going on in what has been approved in the UK, reliance on the UK, et cetera, et cetera. So my own view is that the SSM view on this is the one that is appropriate and is well articulated. And I haven't come across any dissent from that sort of positively articulated view of it. On the PRA's letter, I don't have any particular views beyond the view that it was a very sensible letter for the PRA given where it was, and it sort of complemented well the sort of the activity that we are seeing on our side of, in this case, the Irish Sea, in terms of kind of where firms are. Where firms are. So we have, we found it sort of it's a letter we can fully understand why a regulator in the UK's regulatory position would do it, and be helpful in terms of saying, let's get clarity around some of these things. So I have no sort of strong view on that.
Simon, you have observed this?
Mm-hmm. I mean, yes is the answer.
Okay. Do you agree?
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, absolutely is the answer. This is one of these things that firms can't answer these questions easily because they don't know what's going to happen. But the regulator's not asking them what's going to happen. The regulator's asking, what's your plan? And we do know that, well, I know from talking to firms, that most people thought they had a pretty good plan. Then when they sat down to answer the Sam Woods letter, they found all sorts of things that they really should have thought about and perhaps hadn't.
Sam Woods referring to the head of regulation at the PRA. Right?
Yes, who wrote this famous letter to everybody in London saying, what exactly are your plans? This, in my view, is supervision at its absolute best.
Maybe a brief question to Mr. Pontoiseau, because we're lucky to have you as another national competent authority. Of all the stuff we've been saying here, is there anything where you feel the perspective seen from Paris, and meaning Paris AMF, not Paris ESMA, is slightly different, or would you say nothing to dissent from? Microphone. Because it's live streamed, the microphone is a must.
No, I believe we are quite aligned, and we share many views. Just maybe to react on two topics that were mentioned earlier on the question of how do you supervise a business which is not localized. We have to recognize that, and it's not new. It's not only a fintech question. In March 2000, I was a young trainee at SocGen. I was on the floor, derivatives trading, and they already had a trading desk in Singapore, in Tokyo, in New York, cooperating in a very effective way. So that's not that new, actually. But the key question, there are very, very hard legal questions on where the service is localized, and that's things we struggle with since 20 years at least. But the key question is who's responsible for what business within the firm and among regulators. And if you have some sort of global mix of shared responsibilities, then you might have a risk that the guy in front believes you do the job and you believe he does the job. So that's something important in my opinion. And in relation to the question of regulators' cooperation, I fully agree that we need MOUs or some sort of framework to be able to share data as we need to share information and so on. I'm not going to go on the political field because that's not my bite, but we today have open lines with supervisors at the FCA, and I see no reason why we shouldn't have, in some form, these lines of communications open after Brexit, whatever form it takes.
Unless the EU 27 adopts the policy that everything should be done in French, right? Other questions?
Well, the UK is, after all, supposed to have more French speakers than any other EU member state.
And as you remember, the court of the King of England until the late 14th century spoke exclusively in French.
Absolutely, law French.
So we have discussed a lot about investment firms and a bit about asset managers. We haven't said anything about insurers. Is there anything special about insurers? Do any of you want to talk about it, or it's too jargon-ridden anyway?
No, I think the a lot of the discussions are similar, or there's they adjusted for local doing. I suppose one of the things about insurance is that depending on the type of insurance, is that the understanding of the local environment, if you're insuring risks in a local context, presence there to understand those risks. So, for example, legal system risks, road traffic habits, all those things. That sort of adds an added dimension. I think that I don't think it goes to the heart of the discussions that we're having at the moment. But in the past, where we've had discussions of kind of insurance companies locating somewhere to do a certain type of business elsewhere in the world, you do get into how does that actually work? How do you understand the risks in South America if you're based in Paris or Madrid or Dublin or whatever? But that's, I think, that apart, the principles that we're discussing at the moment are broadly similar.
Do you see the issues we are discussing today playing out similarly for insurers?
Well, first of all, leaving aside the whole horrible and difficult challenge of Lloyd's of London, which is just too unique and complicated. But as far as the insurance industry is concerned, first of all, the insurance industry, to a very large extent, is a kind of subdivision of the asset management industry. A life insurer is a fund manager with a small mortality business. But insurers have generally been much more used than banks or investment firms or anybody else to operating in these sort of more fragmented structures with more national subsidiaries. So for an insurer, actually this is a lot easier because they've never really had the sort of single legal entity global business structure that you tend to find with banks. So I think the reason we hear less from the insurers in this context is because it's actually not as big a problem for them as it is for some other types of firm.
Okay, we still have space for one or two questions. The room is much more subdued in terms of asking questions than I had expected. Donald, help us. You have more questions, I know that.
I can come up with that. I mean, just then as a follow-up to what we discussed earlier on supervisory cooperation, I did note in the outsourcing paper by ESMA that they made specific note of the fact that the continued operation of existing delegation outsourcing was contingent on cooperation agreements. And that was noteworthy that was placed in the paper, because one would assume, particularly given the context of the paper, that cooperation was at the level of the supervisors, and that was partly behind my question. Cooperation at the level of supervisors was a given at the level of orderly market. So that was, if I will, a follow-up, that was mentioned explicitly by ESMA as a condition for continued activity.
So, if I understand you correctly, you imply that in a cliff edge, hard Brexit, disastrous scenario, it's not self-evident that we will have this sort of agreement for cooperation?
I just note the fact that ESMA noted the fact that it's contingent on the existence of these cooperation agreements, and the very fact of noting the fact that cooperation agreements are needed for this continued activity would raise a question over whether they will exist.
And us noting the fact that they noted the fact. But is it, I mean, Jerry, you will say this is too political, but is it conceivable, even in the most disastrous scenario of unilateral Brexit, no deal, no whatever, is it conceivable that the UK authorities would not have those agreements with their EU27 counterparts?
Well, I mean, there are existing precedent agreements. The UK could put those in place in an afternoon if it wanted to. But that's, coming back to my earlier point, that's not something supervisors can or will do of their own motion. The decision to do that is ultimately a political decision. It's, you know, most inter-supervisor memoranda say absolutely nothing, to be perfectly honest. They're frameworks that protect cooperation rather than legislative mandates that compel it. So that it's not a hard thing to do, and the obstacles to doing it are not technical, they are political.
So, I mean, so I think that's been a helpful discussion. I sort of see at least three aspects to it. I think Simon's point about the, you know, what happens in death is absolutely, you know, is a core one. We all know clearly and strongly from the crisis that unless you have some form of overarching legal set of requirements, memorandum of understanding, or anything else you might put in place, will not stand up to the fire of a crisis. And that reads all the way. Simon and I have been discussing this for at least 10 years in the context of resolution, etc. That feeds all the way back to how supervision is done. So that's true. I think, however, you can abstract from that and say, in terms of how we get comfortable with, for example, how an entity is operating in the context of a group, is if we understand how the group is being supervised, and we understand the standards to which the group is being supervised, and we know the regulator and supervisor of that group, let's take the PRA, and we know what they're like and we have a good relationship with them, then if you're supervising the entity, you're in a much more relaxed posture than if you think, well, I don't know what the rules are, I don't know who the supervisor, what they really is. So there's sort of that question of cooperation with the supervisor gives you significant comfort as the subsidiary's parent. But then thirdly, coming back to the point on ESMA, I read that as simply being a reference to what's currently in the UCITS legislation. I think it's the UCITS legislation, which is it may be AIFMD, which is the requirement to have an MOU in place at the moment to outsource to third countries. So I just read that as being a reference to that. So I wouldn't read anything further into that.
Donald, what were you murmuring?
Absolutely.
AFND. Okay. On this note, I thought somebody would make a joke about substance abuse at some point during the discussion, but Thanks for your participation. Thanks particularly to our two speakers, and let me suggest we give them a well-deserved round of applause.